Hello and welcome back to another episode of a Cozy Christmas podcast. My name is Art and welcome back to a brand new season. Now I think this is the 6th season, maybe my 5th year. My wife and I were debating that the other day, and I started in 2020. And so this would be my 6th year I'm starting, but I've finished 5 years, or she thought maybe it was only 4.5 because I didn't start until like July of 2020. But I count seasons as that going from January to December. So that would be a season. So even though it was only July to December, it was one season. I don't know. Whatever number I'm on, I'm glad to be back. And I'm glad that you're here with me as we begin the long journey to Christmas 2025. I hope you had a great Christmas. I had a really relaxing Christmas day. I got about 7 or 8 books for Christmas. Some other gifts I got that I've enjoyed are a warm, cozy bathrobe, and my oldest son got me a neck and back massager, which I joked about how that I'm starting to get presents now, like I'm an old man. But I tell you what, that neck massager was really nice. It came in handy a few times already, where I get these knots and pain in my neck and back, and it just really helps to loosen that all up. So yeah, I'm not going to complain. But I got some great books, a couple of Christmassy ones, as well as some other books that I know I'll enjoy. So that was a great way to end. And then I was able to have a lovely Christmas vacation. And while on vacation, I read Mrs. Claus in the Nightmare Before New Year's. On my BookTube channel, Art's Bookshelf Odyssey, I gave a review on that book, and as well as the Mrs. Claus series as a whole. Everyone here knows my love for that series, so if you want to hear me talk about that series again, the video is up on my YouTube channel on at Art's Bookshelf Odyssey. But as I look back at the year, 2024 is definitely going to be a year that we look back on as being a year of difficulty and heartache, a year of illness and trials, but we all made it. My family and I, we still love one another, and that's really what matters, right? My good friend Ken at the North Pole News Dispatch would say, "Be where your feet are." And I really carried that thought into this Christmas season. Don't let the fact that things aren't perfect ruin your fun. Make new memories, be present in the moment, and bring joy where you can. So what's ahead for 2025? I'll be honest, I'm not even quite sure what's ahead on this episode. So I had thoughts going into the new year, but they're just thoughts right now. I have no idea what the days ahead will bring. As I mentioned before I signed off last year, I do plan to continue to podcast throughout this year. I've said before, this is a real source of joy in my life, and I'm not ready to hang it up yet. Many more years to come, I hope. But let me know how your Christmas went. I would love to read and share your emails on an upcoming episode. So please reach out to cozychristmaspodcast@gmail.com. The story I have today is from the Diaries of the Reverend Francis Kilvert. It's considered to be one of the very best of English diaries. I read this last year, and I really enjoyed it. It's a journal or a diary of a Welsh clergyman, and he talks about just his daily life, the people in his community, the people in his parish, the different families that he checked in on, and some who were sick, and some of the tragedy that happened, but some of the joys of life as well. And what I really enjoyed was his descriptions of the world around him, nature, during winter, during summer, the different things were just so beautiful. One section of his nature writing that I found particularly beautiful, he is describing a scene where he sees two men fishing on a lake, and he sees a buck in the distance as well. And he says this: "To eye and ear, it was a beautiful picture. The strange hoarse bellowing of the buck, the fluttering of the coot as she skimmed the water with her melancholy note, the cry of the swans across the lake, the clicking of the reels as the fishermen wound up or let out their lines, the soft murmur of the woods, the quiet rustle of the red and golden drifts of beech leaves, the rush of the waterfall, the light tread of the dappled herd of deer, dark and dim, glancing across the green glades from shadow into sunlight and rustling under the beeches." And then he goes on to say, "Why do I keep this voluminous journal? I can hardly tell. Partly because life appears to me such a curious and wonderful thing that it almost seems a pity that even such a humble and uneventful life as mine should pass altogether away without some such record as this. And partly, too, because I think the record may amuse and interest some who come after me." And I love that little bit of self-awareness that he has, that this might be entertaining to some who come after him. But, there is a sense, too, that every life is precious and has value, and as much as we can, ought to be remembered. And so what I want to do is share some of the Christmas and winter readings that Francis Kilvert wrote on how he celebrated Christmas and some of the observations he made of the world around him. So happily, it's a cold winter day today, a perfect day to come inside and warm up here by my fire. And I'll read to you from the journals of Reverend Francis Kilvert, edited by William Plomer. Sunday, Christmas Day, December 25th, 1870. As I lay awake praying in the early morning, I thought I heard a sound of distant bells. It was an intense frost. I sat down in my bath upon a sheet of thick ice, which broke in the middle into large pieces, whilst sharp points and jagged edges struck all round the sides of the tub like chevaux de frise, not particularly comforting to the naked thighs and loins, for the keen ice cut like broken glass. The ice water stung and scorched like fire. I had to collect the floating pieces of ice and pile them on a chair before I could use the sponge, and then I had to thaw the sponge in my hands, for it was a mass of ice. The morning was most brilliant. Walked to the Sunday school with Gibbons, and the road sparkled with millions of rainbows, the 7 colors gleaming in every glittering point of hoarfrost. The church was very cold in spite of 2 roaring stove fires. Monday, December 26th. Much warmer and almost a thaw. Left Cliro at 11 a.m. At Chippenham, my father and John were on the platform. After dinner, we opened a hamper of game sent by the Venables and found in it a pheasant, a hare, a brace of rabbits, a brace of woodcocks, and a turkey, just like them and their constant kindness. Tuesday, December 27th, 1870. After dinner, drove into Chippenham with Perch and bought a pair of skates at Banks for 17.6. Across the fields to the Draycott water, and the young Audrey ladies chaffed me about my new skates. I had not been on skates since I was here last, 5 years ago, and was very awkward for the first 10 minutes. But the knack soon came again. There was a distinguished company on the ice: Lady Dangan, Lord and Lady Royston and Lord George Paget all skating. Also Lord and Lady Sidney and a Mr. Calcroft, whom they all of course called the hangman. I had the honor of being knocked down by Lord Royston, who was coming round suddenly on the outside edge, a large fire of logs burning within an enclosure of wattled hurdles. Harriet Audrey skated beautifully and jumped over a half-sunken punt. Arthur Law, skating, jumped over a chair on its legs. Wednesday, December 28th. An inch of snow fell last night, and as we walked to Draycott to skate, the snowstorm began again. As we passed Langley Burrell Church, we heard the strains of the quadrille band on the ice at Draycott. The afternoon grew murky, and when we began to skate, the air was thick with falling snow. But it soon stopped, and gangs of laborers were at work immediately sweeping away the new fallen snow and skate cuttings of ice. The Lancers was beautifully skated. When it grew dark, the ice was lighted with Chinese lanterns, and the intense glare of blue, green, and crimson lights and magnesium ribbon made the whole place as light as day. The people skated with torches. Thursday, December 29th. Skating at Draycott again with perch. Fewer people on the ice today. No quadrille band, torches, or fireworks, but it was very pleasant, cozy, and sociable. Yesterday, when the Lancers was being skated, Lord Royston was directing the figures. Harriet Audrey corrected him in one figure, and he was quite wrong. But he immediately left the quadrille and sat down sulking on the bank, saying to one of his friends, "Those abominable Miss Audreys have contradicted me about the Lancers." This was overheard and repeated to Harriet by a mutual friend, and the next time she saw him, she said meaningly, "Lord Royston sometimes remarks are overheard and repeated," or something to that effect. However, soon after he wanted to make it up, and asked her to skate up the ice hand in hand with him. "Certainly not, Lord Royston," she said. Lady Royston skates very nicely and seems very nice. A sledge chair was put on the ice, and Lady Royston and Lady Dangan, Margaret, Fanny, Maria, and Harriet Audrey were drawn about in it by turns, Charles Audrey pushing behind, and Edmund and Arthur and Walter pulling with ropes. It was a capital team, and went at a tremendous pace up and down the ice. A German lady's maid from Draycott House was skating and making ridiculous antics. Tuesday, January 7th, 1873. At 8 o'clock, Fanny, Dora, and I went to a jolly party at Sir John Audrey's at Norton House. Almost everybody in the neighborhood was there. There had been a children's party with a Christmas tree at 5 o'clock, but when we drove up, the harp and the fiddles were going. I danced a Lancers with Harriet Audrey of Draycott Rectory, a quadrille with Sissy Audrey of Seagree Vicarage, a Lancers with Louise Audrey of Draycott Rectory, a Lancers with Mary Rook of the Ivy, and Sir Roger with dear little Francie Rook of the Ivy. How bright and pretty she looked, so merry, happy, and full of fun. It was a grand Sir Roger. I never danced such a one. The room was quite full, 2 sets and such long lines, but the crush was all the more fun. "Here," said Francie Rook to me quietly, with a wild, merry sparkle in her eye, and her face brilliant with excitement, "let us go into the other set." There was more fun going on there. Eliza Stiles had just fallen prostrate. There were screams of laughter, and the dance was growing quite wild. There was a struggle for the corners, and everyone wanted to be at the top. In a few minutes all order was lost, and everyone was dancing wildly and promiscuously with whoever came to hand. The dance grew wilder and wilder. The pipers loud and louder blew, the dancers quick and quicker flew. Madder and madder screamed the flying fiddle bows. Sir Roger became a wild romp till the fiddles suddenly stopped dead, and there was a scream of laughter. Oh, it was such fun, and Francie Rook was brilliant. When shall I have another such partner as Francie Rook? An excellent supper, and we got home about 1 o'clock on a fine moonlit night. Sunday, January 12th. 1873. When I came out, the night was superb. The sky was cloudless, the moon rode high and full in the deep blue vault, and the evening star blazed in the west. The air was filled with the tolling and chiming of bells from St. Paul's and Chippenham Old Church. The night was soft and still, and I walked up and down the drive several times before I could make up my mind to leave the wonderful beauty of the night and go indoors. To be alone out of doors on a still, soft, clear moonlit night is to me one of the greatest pleasures that this world can give. Saturday, December 12th, 1874. There is a beauty in the trees peculiar to winter, when their fair, delicate, slender tracery unveiled by leaves, and showing clearly against the sky, rises bending with a lofty arch or sweeps gracefully drooping. The crossing and interlacing of the limbs, the smaller boughs and tender twigs make an exquisitely fine network, which has something of the severe beauty of sculpture, while the tree in summer, in its full pride and splendor and color of foliage, represents the loveliness of painting. The deciduous trees, which seem to me most graceful and elegant in winter, are the birches, limes, and beeches. Thursday, Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1874. Writing Christmas letters all the morning. In the afternoon, I went to the church with Dora and Teddy to put up the Christmas decorations. Dora has been very busy for some days, past making the straw letters for the Christmas text. Fair Rosamond and good Elizabeth Knight came to the church to help us, and worked heartily and well. They had made some pretty ivy knots and bunches for the pulpit panels, and the ivy blossoms, cleverly whitened with flour, looked just like white flowers. The church warden, Jacob Knight, was sitting by his sister in front of the roaring fire. We were talking of the death of Major Torrens on the ice at Corsham Pond yesterday. Speaking of people slipping and falling on ice, the good church warden sagely remarked, "Some do fall on their faces, and some do fall on their rumps, and they as do hold theirselves uncommon stiff do most and generally fall on their rumps." I took old John Bryant a Christmas packet of tea and sugar and raisins from my mother. The old man had covered himself almost entirely over in his bed to keep himself warm, like a marmot in its nest. He said, "If I live till New Year's Day, I shall have seen 96 New Years." He said also, "I do often see things flying about me, thousands and thousands of them about half the size of a large pea, and they are red, white, blue, and yellow in all colors. I asked Mr. Morgan what they were, and he said they were the spirits of just men made perfect." Saturday, St. Stephen's Day, 1874. This morning, soon after breakfast, Lucy Halliday came up to ask me to go and see Hannah Williams, as she was worse. I went immediately and found her in a sad state of suffering. The proud, haughty, beautiful face was laid low at last, and flushed with pain, the thick black hair contrasting vividly with the white pillow, as the poor child tossed her shapely head, rolling wearily from side to side, seeking rest, and finding none. Then for a minute she lay silent with closed eyes and flushed cheek and buried in the pillows. And then once more began the bitter pain and the weary moaning, "Oh, mother, oh, mother." Her father knelt at the foot of the bed, holding her feet tenderly, for the agony was in her legs and feet. Last Wednesday night, while carrying a bucket of water from the well, she slipped upon the icy path and fell heavily upon her back. We fear her spine was injured, for though she suffers acute pain in her legs, she cannot move them. The poor, wild, beautiful girl is stopped in her wilderness at last, and, perhaps, by the finger of God. I saw Hannah Williams again this afternoon and sat a while by her bedside, repeating the evening hymn, "Son of my soul." This evening Teddy left us to return to London. A sharp frost, the stars brilliant and the roads glassed with ice. I went with him to the white gate where we parted, and I turned off across the dark, icy fields towards the village to try to read Hannah Williams to sleep. She had sunk to sleep 2 minutes before I got there, said her mother, coming noiselessly and gratefully to the head of the stairs. The light shone through the night from the sick girl's chamber window. The night was still, an owl hooted out of the south, and the mighty hunter Orion, with his glittering sword, silently overstrode the earth. Sunday, Childermas Eve, 1874. Before I went to church this morning, I went to see Hannah Williams. Before I reached the cottage, I heard the poor girl's distressing moans. They were moving her in her bed, and it was heart-rending to hear her. After tea, I went to see Hannah and try to read the poor child to sleep. I stayed there an hour or more, turning her in bed every quarter of an hour. She says I turn her and lift her better than anyone else. Monday, Childermas Day. Today we heard by a short telegram of the awful calamity of the burning of the emigrant ship Caspatria near the Cape of Good Hope, bound for New Zealand. 440 persons burnt in her. One boat reached St. Helena with 3 survivors who had lived on the flesh of their companions. I went to see Hannah Williams. The inflammatory rheumatism has gone, partly out of her legs, but her poor hands are now in fiery, agonizing pain. She can bear them in almost boiling water. I talked to her very seriously about her past wild conduct since her confirmation and prayed with her. Then I read her The May Queen, New Year's Eve, The Conclusion, The Miller's Daughter, and St. Agnes Eve, hoping to read her to sleep, but in vain. I met the doctor, Mr. Spencer, here this morning. He told me he had feared at first inflammation of the spinal cord, which might have carried Hannah off in 48 hours. Thursday, New Year's Eve, 1874. Edwin Law told me of an infallible receipt for warming cold and wet feet on a journey. Pour half a glass of brandy into each boot. Also, he often carries a large pair of stockings with him to wear over boots and trousers. He has been a long time in Nova Scotia. My mother and I sat up by the dining room fire to watch the old year out and the new year in. Soon after 11 o'clock, the Chippenham bells began pealing and continued to ring at intervals till after midnight. The wind had veered into the south and brought the sound of the bells to us very distinct and sweet across the river, so that we could plainly hear when they began and paused, and all the change ringing in the firing of the bells. At 11:45, I began to think earnestly of dear Katie and to pray for her. I knew she would be watching, praying, and thinking of me. I had laid before me on my desk the photograph of her in her riding habit and the New Year's card I had just received from her. She seemed to be very near me. I felt her love all around me, and I was very happy. My last thoughts and prayers in the old year 1874 were for her. The second Sunday in Advent, December 8th, 1878. Fine and cold in the morning, overcast in the afternoon, glass falling and snow threatening. Good congregations. In the bright, sunny morning, the sheep were all dotted white about the green slopes across the river. They were all lying down, almost at even distances from each other. It was a peaceful pastoral scene. There is a still green beauty peculiar to a fine winter's morning and afternoon, which is not seen in summer. Monday, December 16th, 1878. The ground very slippery and dangerous. Children sliding on the Wye below Bredwardine Bridge, where the river is frozen half across. At Maka's Bridge, the Wye is frozen entirely over. Snow began to fall at 9 a.m. and continued to fall till 2 p.m. Tuesday, December 17th, 1878. Sharp frost again last night. The snow clouds cleared off and the day became cloudless and blue and brilliant. The bridge in the sunshine was most beautiful. We have cut down several of the shrubs, evergreen oak, Portugal laurel, and laurestinus under the cedar nearest the house, and the laurel garden hedge, so as to let in more light and a pretty view of the lawn river, and bridge. As I went up the steep snowy hill to Bethel, I pursued the fast retreating and ascending wan sunshine of the still winter afternoon. I overtook the sunshine just before I got to the lone house on the bleak, windy hilltop. All the valley and plain lay bathed in a frosty, rosy, golden glow, and just as I got to Kai Perthen, the sun was setting behind the lone level, snowy blue-white line of the Black Mountain, and the last rays were reddening the walls and chimney stack of the solitary cottage. As I came down into the sheltered hollow of the lower Coombe, in the twilight, I heard rising from the cottage in the dingle across the brook a woman's voice addressing a naughty child, and uttering the threatening promise, which in this form is probably as old as the English language, and in some form is perhaps as old as the world. "I'll whip your bottom." Were bottoms so formed that they might be whipped? Or why, since the foundation of the world, has this part of the human body been universally chosen to suffer chastisement? Friday, December 20th, 1878. Hard frost. I reached the school with great difficulty owing to the icy state of the roads, especially on the hillside. Called at the cottage. Miss Newton has given a text to Bredwardine Church for Christmas, and an IHS banner to Brobury. Advent service in Bredwardine Church at 7 p.m. Sir George Cornwall walked over from Machus to preach, coming through the field and supporting himself in the slippery places with a spud walking stick. Between 30 and 40 people in church, which we thought a fair congregation, considering the weather and icy roads. Saturday, December 21st, 1878. St. Thomas's Day. Hard frost. Roads icy, many accidents to man and horse from slipping and falling. Called on Mrs. Williams, who said her children were out slithering. Climbed up the steep, icy bank to Godsall's with great difficulty. There I found a son come home from Canada with his wife. He seemed weak and ill, but very pleasant and intelligent. He had been in Hamilton, knew a good deal about Francis Edwin Kilvert, now mayor and member for Hamilton, and was interested to know that he was my first cousin. He had recognized the name. He had often seen Sir John Macdonald. I told him that Lady Macdonald was a playfellow of mine. He gave me much interesting information about the Indian tribes and free traders and political parties in the Dominion. Monday, December 23rd, 1878. Very hard frost. The Wye froze across below Bredwardine Bridge, between the vicarage garden and the Brobury shore. It has been frozen over and the ice passable for some time at Machus. Visited Priscilla Price and took her a pudding and some mince pies for Christmas. Snow deep on the hill. Tuesday, December 24th, Christmas Eve. Very hard frost. Brilliant sunshine on sparkling snow. After breakfast, I went to the Old Weston to see the poor Davieses and comfort them concerning their child. On the road, I met David Davies, the father, the shepherd at the Weston, on his way to the village to order the coffin, and to the churchyard to mark out the ground for the grave. He told me it was not Andrew, as I had been informed and supposed, but little Davy, who is dead. The father seemed greatly distressed and indignant because he thought the child's life had been thrown away by some mistake of the doctor. I went on to the house of mourning. Margaret Davies seemed very glad to see me, and her humble gratitude for my visit was most touching. She took me upstairs into the room where the dead child was lying on the bed, and turned down the sheet from his face. I never saw death look so beautiful. There was no bandage round the chin. The pretty, innocent child face looked as peaceful and natural as if the child were asleep, and the dark curls lay upon the little pillow. I could hardly believe he was dead. Leaving the face still uncovered, the poor mother knelt with me by the little bedside while I prayed for them all. She was deeply touched and most humbly grateful. Before I left the room, I stooped and kissed the child's forehead, and the mother did the same. It was as cold and hard as marble. This is always a fresh surprise. I had not touched death for more than 30 years, and it brought back the sudden shock that I felt when, as a child, I was taken into a room at Harden Hewish Rectory where our little sister lay dead and was told to touch her hand. Margaret Davies told me that before little Davies died, he saw a number of people and some pretty children dancing in a beautiful garden and heard some sweet music. Then someone seems to have called him, for he answered, "What do you want with me?" He also saw beautiful birds and the men of the Weston who carried him to his funeral. He thought his little sister Margaret was throwing ice and snow on him. The snow fell on the coffin at the burial. On the road, I overtook Miss Stokes and went into the old court with her, but before Kate could come and speak to me, my nose began to bleed, and I was obliged to fly. Wednesday, Christmas Day, December 25th, 1878. Very hard frost last night. At Prestane, the thermometer fell to 2 degrees, showing 30 degrees of frost. At Monington, it fell to 4. Last night is said to have been the coldest night for 100 years. The windows of the house and church were so thick with frost rime that we could not see out. We could not look through the church windows all day. Snow lay on the ground, and the day was dark and gloomy with a murky sky. A fair morning congregation, considering the weather. By Miss Newton's special desire, Dora and I went to the cottage to eat our Christmas dinner at 1:30, immediately after service. Immediately after dinner, I had to go back to the church, for the funeral of little Davy of the Old Weston, who died on Monday, was fixed for 2:15. The weather was dreadful, the snow driving in blinding clouds, and the walking tiresome. Yet the funeral was only 20 minutes late. The welcome home, as it chimed softly and slowly to greet the little pilgrim coming to his rest, sounded bleared and muffled through the thick, snowy air. The snow fell thickly all through the funeral service, and at the service by the grave a kind woman offered her umbrella, which a kind young fellow came and held over my head. The woman and man were Mrs. Richards and William Jackson. I asked the poor mourners to come in and rest and warm themselves, but they would not, and went into church. The poor father, David Davies the shepherd, was crying bitterly for the loss of his little lamb. Owing to the funeral, it was rather late before we began the afternoon service. There were very few people in church beside the mourners. The afternoon was very dark. I was obliged to move close to the great south window to read the lessons, and could hardly even see then. I preached from Luke 2, verse 7. There was no room for them in the inn, and connected the little bed in the churchyard in which we laid Davy to rest with the manger cradle at Bethlehem. In spite of the heavy and deep snow, there was a fair congregation at Browbury Church. I walked there with Powell. The water was out in Browbury Lane. As we came back, a thaw had set in and rain fell. By Miss Newton's special wish, I went to the cottage and spent the evening with Dora. The cottage servants had invited the vicarage servants to tea and supper, and they came into the drawing room after supper and sang some Christmas carols. Sunday, December 29th, 1878. Sudden thaw and breakup of the frozen river. Huge masses and floes of ice have been coming down the river all day, rearing, crushing, grinding against each other, and thundering against the bridge. A crowd of people were on the bridge, looking over the parapet and watching the ice pass through the arches. The ground very slippery and dangerous, people walking along the ditches and going on all fours up Bredwardine Hill and across the Lion Square. Emma Jones's mother came all the way from Dorstone to Bredwardine in the ditches. Price was obliged to go up the hill from the cottage to his house on all fours, and Jane Davies of Fine Street confessed to Dora that she had to crawl on the ice across the Lion Square on her hands and knees. It was very slippery and dangerous as I went to Browbury. Coming back, the water was out across the lane, and giving Clara Powell my lantern to hold, I carried her in my arms across the water. New Year's Day, 1879. I sat up last night to watch the old year out and the new year in. The church bells rang at intervals all last night and all today. At 6 I went to Craft a Web to begin my cottage lectures there. It was raining fast when I started, but when I got as far as the common, I noticed that the ground was white. At first I thought it was moonlight. Then I saw it was snow. At Craft a Web the snowstorm was blinding and stifling, and I passed by Priest's cottage where I was going to hold the lecture without seeing it in the thickness of the driving snow. Before the lecture I went in to see old John Williams. On opening the door I was confronted by the motionless, silent figure of a person veiled and wearing a conical cap, which I presently discovered to be a dead pig hanging up by its snout. John Williams deplored my being out in such a night and said it was not fit for me. There were not many people at the service, but the usual faithful few. When I came back the storm was worse and so thick and driving that I was glad I was between hedges and not out on the open hill. The young people at the servants' party seemed to be enjoying themselves with dancing and singing. After supper they came into the dining room to sing to me, each with a comical cap out of a cracker on her head. Then there was a snapdragon, and they went away about 10:30. Tuesday, January 14th, 1879. Last night the river rose rapidly, and at midnight the ice was rushing down in vast masses, roaring, cracking, and thundering against the bridge like the rolling of 100 wagons. By morning the river had sunk and left huge piles of ice stranded on the banks. Tuesday, January 21st, 1879. Very cold, bitter east wind and hard frost. Visited Carver and Davies of the old house. William Davies of Lanafan came in. The father and son were telling me of the games and sports, the fights and merriments that went on in old times upon Redwarding Nap. What kind of games? I asked. I wouldn't suggest, said William Davies, that they were of any spiritual good. Friday, February 7th, 1879. The birds are beginning to sing again by the river after the hard frost and the long winter. Thursday, February 28th, 1879, March Eve. Walking in the garden in the evening, I discovered that the intense frost of last month had caused a slip and settlement of the rail on the terrace walk, and caused the wall supporting the terrace to bulge dangerously. A large slice of the vicarage riverbank, just below the hydraulic ram, has slipped into the river. The churchyard wall has bulged. Browbury churchyard wall has been thrown down by the frost. The walls all over the place have been strained and shaken. The plaster is peeling and shelling off the house and conservatory, and the steps from the upper to the lower garden are in ruins. This is the work of the frost of 1878 to 1879. All right, that was Kilvert's diary. Some selections from 1870 to 1879. I decided to read just a couple of entries past January to wrap it up because I kind of wanted to at least end on a happier note. That Christmas of 1878 was really difficult. And unfortunately, that was the last Christmas that he would ever have. He passed away later that year. He actually ended up getting married a little bit later in life, but he got married and then he died within a month after that. But I debated whether or not to include them, but I decided to include them just so you could get the full experience of what life was like back then in the 1870s. Reverend Kilvert talks about the fun, the games, the dancing, the food. He talks about how hard the weather is, but then he also talks about the hardship of losing a child, especially at that time of year. And he writes with such tenderness. He sounds like he was a very good man. Backing up a few years, is it no wonder then that the story of Tiny Tim in A Christmas Carol resonated with so many people? Because this was a reality that they really had no recourse for if a child were to be injured or their life was to pass, I mean, there was very little in the way of medicine or help that could get to them. Well, I'm looking forward to this new year. I'm looking forward to what will come. Do keep an eye out on my social medias. I have some plans to be a guest on some other podcasts here coming up soon, so you'll want to keep an eye out for that. As far as what will I be doing next time, I think I'll probably be back in February. And I've been toying with the idea of looking at Christmas in different parts of the world, and which I've done a little bit here and there from time to time, but I really want to make a little more organized approach to that this year. I thought that might be fun. Maybe begin with like the top 10 countries that this podcast has listened to, which I went and looked at the stats the other day just to see that. Unsurprisingly, my top countries other than America, of course, were Canada and then the Great United Kingdom were the kind of the top three. So not a real surprise there, but it's neat to think that I'm reaching people around the world. So let me go ahead and just give you a heads up now that if you are in a country and think that you might have some interesting holiday traditions that America doesn't know about or find interesting, let me know. Send them my way. But with that, I'll go ahead and sign off for today. Please feel free to follow me on social medias. I'm on just about every one that I can think of anyway. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky I started. I haven't really been active on that, but I made an account. You can find me there, and including on YouTube as well. And if you'd like to buy me a coffee or help support the podcast, there's a link in the description down below. And all that money goes back to supporting the podcast. Really appreciate your help. The best thing you can do, though, is to leave a good review, share it on your social media. Yes, it's January, but I guarantee somebody out there wants to hear something cozy and Christmassy. I will see you again in a couple of weeks, hopefully. And so until then, let's remember to honor Christmas in our hearts and try to keep it all the year. Have a very Merry Christmas.